Welcome back to another day of Bible study as we continue on through our Advent Jesse Tree journey. We are walking day by day through Jesus' family tree and also along the way looking at some of the characteristics of God and of humans throughout the Hebrew scriptures in order to kind of set the stage for the arrival on December 25th of Jesus, whom we believe is the fulfillment of the Messiah passages in the Old Testament. If you'd like to find out more about this journey, how you can be a part, how you can get the ornaments and the study guide that go along with this, I know that we are in smack dab kind of in the middle of this journey, but that is absolutely okay. You'll be able to finish it out at home, and you can use this each and every year with your family, with yourself. So if you'd like to know more about how you can get one or how you can join the journey through this Advent, that URL right there, go.christtable.today/Jesse Tree. And if you'd like to find out more about Christ Table, who we are, what we're all about, how you can partner and be involved with what we're doing in ministry and in spiritual resources, that URL right there, www.christtable.today, will give you all of the information that you need. Today, we find ourselves in 1 Samuel chapter 16, the first 13 verses, and we'll read through all of these verses together. The story may be familiar to you, though you might not have seen some of the highlights of the story. And this one is, I think, particularly a great story to utilize with kids. And so if you have children in the home or you're using this Advent journey with kids, then I would definitely encourage you today, if you don't usually read the full text, if you don't usually pull out the Bible and go beyond just the focus verse that we have in a little devotional, today I would actually encourage you to read the entirety of the text with your kids, because it's going to resonate deeply with them and drive some conversations. Now, our ornament for today that comes out of the bag is this one right here. It is a crown, which is intended to be the symbol for King David, because King David is central to our text today in 1 Samuel chapter 16. So why don't we just go ahead and jump right into verse 1. Now the Lord said to Samuel, Samuel is the priest who is on duty during this period of time. And so because of the way that the instructions are given, they're given by God, not to usually the king, but are given to the priest. And it was the priest's responsibility essentially to install and to manage the kings. So there is integration there. God says to Samuel, you have mourned long enough for Saul. I have rejected him as king of Israel. So fill your flask with olive oil and get yourself to Bethlehem. Now, Saul was the first king of Israel. Everybody had high hopes for him, but he proved to be unable to overcome his own internal struggles and deficiencies in order to be a king who did what was right in God's eyes more often than not. And so we can kind of say that we can sadly say that Saul was something of a failure as a king. And so God essentially came to the point where he was like, it's time to move on. It's time for a different king and a better king. If we're going to do the king thing, then let's put one in place who honors me. So he tells Samuel, it's time to go ahead and begin this transition. In fact, I know who I want. I want you to go to Bethlehem. I want you to find a man named Jesse who lives there, for I have selected one of his sons to be my king. Now, I want you to look really at this final few words in this first verse before we go on to the rest of the text. This idea of God saying, I myself have selected one of these individuals, one of his sons, to be my king. Well, first of all, it was the people's king, not necessarily God's king, but God is taking responsibility for the king, and God is also taking responsibility now for selecting the king. And first time around, that wasn't the way that it went down. The people were involved in selecting the king. But if you look at the way that this is written in the Hebrew, and I think this is important for us to notice before we move along, it said, I have provided for myself a king from among his sons. Really, we can clearly see in the way that this is written in that English translation for me, and then this direct translation from the Hebrew text, that it is God who is making provision for the king himself, which means that the person who is chosen is going to make sense to God and to God's qualifications rather than to the people and the people's qualifications. We here in the United States, we sometimes see this go down during election times, where what one set of individuals thinks are important qualifications for the office of president are not so much what another group of people highly value as qualifications for the president. And so this is kind of the friction that's happening here in this text and in this time, is God is essentially saying, I know what you think makes a great king. No, I'm gonna provide one that meets my qualifications, and they may not exactly match what you think the qualifications are for a king. I also want you to notice in this verse, if you didn't notice it, that Bethlehem is central again. Now, you may have noticed it because of the time of year. Now, if you're tracking with the entire Advent study and journey of Jesse Tree with us, you will notice that yesterday's story also featured a very prominent city by the name of Bethlehem. And so we have this Ruth and Boaz story that is featuring this place of bread, Bethlehem. Now we have David, whose family, Jesse, also is featured in this city of Bethlehem. Now, why is there this connection there? Well, because Ruth and Boaz are up the line of ancestry for Jesse and for David. And so it does kind of make sense, because the great whatever grandmother of Jesse and David, who's about to be chosen as the next king, is Ruth, who eventually becomes a member of the community of Bethlehem. But what we see here as we travel through the Hebrew scriptures towards December 5th is this city of Bethlehem, which is it's not an important city. It's not a big city. It's really only important because of the people who come from there. Ruth, David, Joseph, Jesus. Keep listening for Bethlehem as we go through this Advent journey. It's going to continue to play a role. So Samuel asks, how can I do that? How can I choose somebody to be the king whenever the king Saul is still the king? If Saul hears about this, he will kill me. Well, take Heifer with you, the Lord replies, almost ignoring Samuel's question, and say that you have come to make a sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you which of his sons to anoint for me. So Samuel did exactly as the Lord instructed, recognizing that God has said, I'll point out the one of Jesse's sons. Who's the one? So when Samuel arrives at Bethlehem, the elders of the town came trembling to meet him. Samuel, a very important figure, and usually whenever the priest shows up in your town, it is not a good thing. What's wrong? They asked, do you come in peace? Yes, Samuel replied, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Purify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. So Samuel performed the purification rite for Jesse and his sons and the entire town, and invited all of them to the sacrifice. And when they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab, who is a son of Jesse, and thought, surely this is our next king. You can imagine what this individual must have been like if Samuel, a priest who knows God well, takes one look at you and says, there is our person. Must have been strong, must have been imposing, must have been a warrior, must have been a leader, the type of person who, whenever they walk into the room, everybody notices and everything revolves around them. They commanded the attention simply by their presence, which isn't just a physical thing, isn't just a mental or wisdom thing, isn't just an emotional thing, but it is all of those things. Whenever someone is able to simply by their presence woo and turn a room. Surely this is the Lord's anointed, Samuel says. But the Lord said to Samuel, there are things you don't see. There is so much to be learned and to be wrestled with in this passage. And for kids, this is a really important message to hear. Don't judge by appearance or height. You know what kids judge each other by? Appearance and height, physicality, maturity, what is on the outside. You know what adults judge people by? The exact same thing that kids judge by. They just get far more devious and creative about how they do it. But we still do it. You know how I know? Well, I'll give you one example, because it is exactly what Samuel does. And I have great faith in your spiritual maturity, but I think compared to Samuel, you might have a run for your money on people who are close to God. He literally, physically, audibly hears God's voice directly to him. And yet he judges wrongly. Just as my kids do, just as I do. I've rejected him, Jesus says, and you probably wouldn't be able to know that because your qualifications aren't my qualifications, and what you see is not what I see. The Lord doesn't see things the way that you see them. People judge by the outward appearance, but I look at the heart. What really counts in a person has more to do with the heart than with the eyes. A great conversation, not just for kids, but a great conversation for adults. What really counts is more what's going on the inside than what's going on the outside. Now, the good news is that culturally, this is a message that gets told all of the time. But I'm going to tell you, you can never hear this message enough. And you can certainly never hear this message enough from religious people, from people of faith, and from God, that what really counts is what's on the inside. Because sadly, religious people are oftentimes the worst at failing at this, right? So then Jesse tells his other son, Abinadab, to step forward and walk in front of Samuel. Strut your stuff, walk this way. But Samuel says, you know, you got a lot going for you, buddy. You may be living in your older brother's shadow a little bit, but if it weren't for him, but God, you're not the one. So Jesse now was just running through the sons. Shimea, but Samuel said, neither is he the one that the Lord has chosen. And in the same way, all seven of Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. Then Samuel asked, are all these the sons you have? And he says, well, they're still the youngest. All seven of Jesse's sons. But Jesse has 8. Think about the way that's written. It'd be like saying all 3 of Kevin's kids did something. Is it possible, Kevin, you've got a 4th? Nah, that one doesn't count. Really? This most says something about the environment of the family that David is growing up in. This Jesse is who the Jesse's tree is named after. But it also says a lot about this 8th son to not even be counted amongst the other sons. Well, yeah, there is Now that I think about it, one more. But he's out in the fields watching the sheep and the goats. Samuel says, OMG. Get the kid. And we are not going to eat any of this food until that kid gets here. And I don't care how cold the food is. So Jesse says, well, I don't want to eat cold food. So you might as well run and get the boy, whom I think is my son, whom I don't think should be king. I think Jesse knew he had 8 sons. I think Jesse was lying to Samuel and God because Jesse probably figured in the back of his head that this 8th kid, I don't want to be king. When your own father is willing to throw you under the bus and hide your very existence in order to prevent you from being what God has already decided for you to be, your family is messed up. Jesse knew he had 8 sons. He knew full well he had 8 sons. He just didn't want that son to be the one that Samuel and God chose, so he hid him. And I have to think, quite honestly, that Jesse had to sit there for a moment and decide whether or not he wanted to admit he had an 8th son or have hot food. I think Jesse probably wrestled with that for just a moment. And you know what he did? He chose hot food over his son. Just saying. Jesse sends for him. It was dark, or the word here is ruddy and handsome with beautiful eyes. So he was pretty on the outside, but for whatever reason, being pretty just wasn't enough. Maybe being pretty on the outside was counterproductive. God said, yeah, let's him, anoint him. Jesse's like, I knew it. Insert expletive, I knew it. So as David stands there among his brothers, Samuel takes the flask of oil he brought, and he anoints David with the oil, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. And the Spirit of the Lord in the Old Testament did not come upon hardly anybody, but David gets it. And I think Jesse is just there folding his hands over his chest saying, whatever. Yeah, the kid who I put out in the field so I don't have to pay some other person to do it, not treating like a son at all, the absent-minded professor out there. Yeah. It is my luck that that's the one that God wants. He gets anointed as king. Now the Spirit of God comes over top of him. What could be worse for my day? Y'all, some of y'all had parents like this. Some of y'all are parents like this. God chose the youngest, the weakest, and the least likely person. And God still, in my experience, seems to always choose the youngest, the weakest, and the least likely person. Now, this doesn't mean if you're the oldest, you're out. If you're the strongest, you're out. If you're the most likely, that you're out. What this says, though, is that God's qualifications for the things that he involves himself with are not ever our qualifications. And that the things that are going on the inside are of far more importance and are of far greater value than the things that are going on the outside or the things that the world judges to be priority. And for those kids who may not be the popular kids or who may have self-esteem issues, which I gotta tell you, a lot of popular athletic kids who on the outside project as though they have it all together, on the inside, they are Davids and they are compensating. Don't assume. Don't assume that your kid knows, or the kids in your sphere of influence know how valuable they are to God, how much worth they have, and how much they will be used by God if they will allow it. And they don't have to worry about whether or not their teachers, their parents, the leaders and influencers in their life, what they think. Because what matters in those moments, what matters in these moments is what God thinks. Make sure the kids in your life know that. And I'll tell you, make sure the big kids in your life know and see that as well. This was way too much fun today. Until tomorrow, happy reading.